Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time you are tuning in. Welcome to Homesteading and Gardening in the Suburbs. I'm Emma from Misfit Gardening and I hope you guys are doing really well. Today we're going to be talking about some tips and tricks to gardening in a raised bed and avoiding some common gardening mistakes that happen, because I know a lot of you are starting to put in your gardens for the very first time, which is wonderful to see. Like, as I've been going out and walking the dogs around my neighbourhood, all I can see is these wonderful little gardens that are popping up all over the place. So let's dig in and talk about raised bed gardens. And the first thing I want to talk about is the placement. So putting your garden in the wrong spot is a huge mistake, and it's really difficult to correct when your beds are built and filled with soil. Like, I've got beds that are in the wrong place because I didn't really think about it or do a dry run with an empty bed before filling it with soil. So set yourself up for success and position your beds with the sun in mind. So most vegetables require 6 hours or more of sunlight each day, and positioning your raised beds so that the short ends are aligned south-north, if you're in the northern hemisphere, are going to maximize that amount of sunlight that your vegetables are going to get. If you're in the southern hemisphere, then you want to be aligning them north-south. So in each case, you're wanting to face the equator because that's where the most amount of sun is. And, make sure that, as you're kind of planning out your garden, it's a really good idea to do it on paper first and just kind of sketch things out. And then if you're able to build raised beds because you're doing them in tall boxes, for example, try and position them out in the garden and, practice walking through them, walking around them. If you're using a wheelbarrow or a stool or something like that you're going to be using as you garden, like, practice with those things, because you're going to find your most used routes for tending your garden, and also you're going to be able to figure out early, like, is this the right place for this raised bed? And you're going to avoid the mistake that I made and putting not just 1 or 2 raised beds, but 6 raised beds in the wrong spot. So in my case, they're too close together and I can't actually comfortably get a wheelbarrow through. We have to do some really weird maneuvering to be able to get the wheelbarrow in and around, and it takes 2 of us to do it, which is really difficult when your wheelbarrow is full of produce or soil because you're topping up your beds. So take those things into account before you fill them with soil. And speaking of placement, also make sure that you want to plant your vegetables in the right spot in your raised bed. So things that like a lot of sun are things like tomatoes, chilies, eggplants, herbs like basil, oregano, thyme. All of those things do really well in the sunniest parts of your raised bed. Things like lettuce or spinach and cilantro, they do a lot better in shady placements because it's a little bit cooler. And plants that are on that south side of your raised bed are going to get the most sunlight, and because of that, they also need to be lower growing so that they don't cast shadows and block the sun from all the other crops. So if you're in the northern hemisphere, you don't want to be planting corn at the very front of your bed in that most southern facing spot, because as it grows up and corn gets tall, it can get to be 8 feet or more. It's going to cast a massive shadow and shade out everything that's growing behind it. So when planting corn, for example, we want to put it at the northern end of the raised bed, so the shadows it casts are going to be behind it. It's not going to be blocking out anything that is growing, right behind there. So avoid planting, shorter plants behind taller plants so they don't get shaded out. And make sure that you plant your raised bed near a water source so you can easily provide your plants with water. And it's really important to have watering plans. And your irrigation system doesn't necessarily need to be, super expensive, state of the art, bells and whistles, fully automated. It takes like the moisture level in the water and then it kicks on the sprinklers. Like, you don't need anything, really like that. I mean, great if you've got that already. But you can build simple irrigation systems using PVC piping. I've seen ones where people are putting like piping that's got holes drilled into it into a raised bed, and then there's a tall pipe that goes up at one end of the raised bed, and they just fill that with water, and then it kind of, travels down into the pipe with the holes in it, and then that sort of spreads the water through, which is pretty cool way to do it, especially if you're hand watering. But you can hook up hose pipes to PVC pipes, and have them all set up so they're going to water for certain amounts of time. But that being said, if an irrigation system is too expensive for you right now, and I understand a lot of people have got a lot of financial issues right now, then the one tip I can give you is to pay close attention to the soil. And if it looks hard or dry, try pushing your finger into the soil, and if it feels dry more than 2 inches into the soil, then you need to get some water on that soil. You can also pick up a handful of soil from your raised bed and squeeze that soil into a loose ball. If it stays together, the soil's just right, it's got moisture in there. If it falls apart or doesn't even form a ball, then it's too dry and you need to get some water on there. Now you can also watch indicator plants. So these are things that wilt really quickly when they're dehydrated. And lettuce is a prime example. Like if that doesn't get enough water, it goes limp and floppy. And it is saying like, yo, I need some drinks over here. So check out your plants, and if things start to look wilty and floppy, then get some water on that bed. Now, if you don't plan for irrigation when you're building your raised beds, then you're going to need to water by hand using a watering can or a hose. I still to this day use the watering can to feed the garden using like my DIY natural fertilizers that I make, things like comfrey tea, those kind of things. I also have to use my watering can in early spring because the secondary water is not yet available. So my system's set up with sprinklers, unfortunately. And I still have to use my watering can to get water to things that have just been planted. It is like end of April as I'm recording this, and the secondary water is not yet on yet, so I'm still having to water things. Now, I don't necessarily like having a hose all over the place because I'm still at risk of frosts because I live at an altitude, and because of that, I can almost guarantee the minute that I get the hose out, that's when I'm going to get frosts, and I'm going to end up with problems with that hose pipe anyway because it's frozen in there. So I still just, fill up my 3-gallon watering can and potter on about the garden. Now, if you can't set up an irrigation system, then consider having a rainwater barrel or some sort of rainwater catchment system close to your raised beds, because it's going to be a lot more convenient being able to move water from a rain barrel that's nearby and filling a watering can than it is if you're having to haul water all the way across the yard. And I can tell you now, hauling water is heavy and it'll get tiresome really quickly on hot days, or if you've got other plans and you're busy. So right now, when I'm trying to water my garden, I'm having to do it early in the morning before I go to work, and I'm having to put aside at least an hour just going to and from watering the raised beds, because I've got 15 plus raised beds, and it takes 1 3-gallon watering can per raised bed to water it thoroughly. Now I water every couple of days, so that's enough to see me through, but if I've got an up late and I'm in a super rush, or let's say I've got a meeting at 8 a.m. and I need to get my butt into work and get things prepped beforehand, then watering my garden at that time's probably not ideal, but doing it by hand, right? Whereas if I had an irrigation system, I could turn on, the tap, let it run for a little bit whilst I'm, making my coffee or making my lunch or whatever, and then turn it off before I head to work. So really think about long term how you are going to irrigate the beds to be successful. I really like soaker hoses and drip lines more than overhead sprinklers, and we've tried setting something up, but because we're on secondary water, you often get like bits and pieces in there, like little bits of debris. It's pretty manky actually, because it's straight from a reservoir and it's not treated, it's not filtered. Like, you definitely don't want to be drinking that stuff. But like, I can't use a drip line because things like the nozzles all get blocked up. Soaker hoses we're looking at changing our overhead sprinklers to a soaker hose system, but again, we know that we're not staying here very long, and we also know that for convenience, having it already as overhead sprinklers just makes it a lot easier for the next person. However, I will tell you that overhead sprinklers not only waste water because you end up watering the pathways too, but they make fungal disease problems like powdery mildew and blight even worse. And yes, if you're listening and you're here in Utah, powdery mildew is a thing, and actually it is worse for us in a drier climate, and overhead watering just makes it a lot worse because you get a lot of splashing. You get a lot of splashing on leaves that are infected, and that splashing is then transferring that fungus onto other leaves. You also get a lot of splashing onto the soil, which then kicks up other potential soil-borne diseases onto your plants, and if they're already stressed, you're going to be introducing more things to it. So I really dislike overhead sprinklers for that reason. Let's talk a little bit about size, right? And size actually matters. So you don't want to start out too big. You want your raised beds to be just the right size. You want them to be easy to work in and work around. So raised beds shouldn't be more than 4 foot wide because you want to be able to reach into the plants that are in the middle of that bed to harvest, prune and feed your garden. If it's bigger than 4 feet wide, you must be an acrobat or something to be able to be comfortably getting into, the middle of the bed without standing on them. And if you've got raised beds near a fence line, then you're actually going to want the width much smaller, maybe about 1 foot, so you can reach all the way to the back of that raised bed without, having to overreach, stretch, do some weird, balancing act to be able to get in there, because you don't want to be standing in your raised beds, right? One of the massive benefits to growing in a raised bed is avoiding soil compaction, and to be able to work in your garden beds without stepping on them, you need to make them smaller, and not stepping on your beds actually promotes much better soil structure because you're not pressing out all the air that's in there. You're going to help build a nice home, a nice set of apartments for a diverse soil ecosystem. So you want to be encouraging things like worms and beneficial microorganisms to set up shop in your garden, because a healthy soil is the key to a healthy garden, and that's what's going to help you have healthier plants for you to enjoy. So also make sure that you've got enough space in between multiple raised beds, right? I told you earlier that, I made a boo-boo and set up raised beds so I can't get a wheelbarrow through them. So you must be able to work between the beds comfortably and walk through the pathways. And if you're using stools and wheelbarrows and stuff when you're out in the garden, make sure that you leave enough space to maneuver those through the beds, and also comfortably turn the wheelbarrow around when it's full. If not, then you're going to get really good at trying to do things backwards. Really, if you can, just place out your raised beds, even if it's just a couple of, planks of wood, just marking out the area, and just kind of practice like, hey, is this going to be enough space for us to get this wheelbarrow through? Is this going to be enough space for me to put my stool here? Is it enough space for me to kneel comfortably between the beds and, be gardening in the middle of this one? And is it easy for me to turn around and do the other side? I'm a bigger girl, I need a bigger space. If you're, super skinny, then you're gonna maybe need a smaller space, but you need to do what's gonna work for you and for your situation, right? I have 3 dogs running around, like I have to have much taller beds so that the dogs are not getting in them. You might just want to have smaller raised beds, ones that are maybe, 6 inches of wooden board that's in that garden space to protect the raised bed that you're building in the soil, and that's okay too. But whatever space that you have, I really, really, really encourage you to practice it and check it out before you fill it all in and set it in stone or in wood, as the case may be. And that brings me on to talking about materials, because materials really matter, and you need to do a bit of research and check what materials are safe to use around your plants, because safety standards and health regulations vary on state to state, region to region, country to country, right? Most garden experts agree that you shouldn't be using pressure-treated wood manufactured prior to 2003. Wood that was treated prior to 2003 contains some really not so sexy heavy metals and compounds in there. So there's things like cremated copper arsenate. That doesn't want to be anywhere near your food garden for a myriad of reasons. Modern methods of pressure treated wood are much safer, but again, depending on where you live, there's different regulations, different notifications, and whether or not you choose to use it is really a personal decision, just like tires to grow food in. I did a episode about growing potatoes in tires, and I wrote an article about it, and people are still looking to see whether they can grow food in these things. Ultimately, it is really a personal decision, and you need to decide whether you want to take those risks into your garden for you and your family. When it comes to tires, I don't grow food in tires anymore. I actually use the tires to grow beneficial plants that are going to attract pollinators into the garden, and that's what I use them for. It's putting them to good use for the minute whilst we try and figure out where we can dispose of them, because you got to pay to get them disposed of. So that's working for us. But when it comes to choosing wood to build your raised bed, we've got things that are pressure treated because we know that we needed something that was going to last longer. Many people choose rot resistant and chemical free woods, so things like cedar or redwood, but they are expendy. You will have to pay more if you're going to go that route. And I know that where I live, I don't get more than 3 years out of them. So I still have to stain my beds every year to protect the wood so they're not rotting, and help kind of keep things together. Within a year of me using, and it was a treated wood, I had mushrooms growing out of the dang thing. So it's going to vary by the area that you are at, and it's really worth talking to other gardeners in your area of what works and what doesn't work. Now, where I lived in the UK, a couple of untreated pine boards was just fine. Like, that lasted for like 5 years in the ground. It wasn't really rotting or anything, but here where I live, because the temperature swings are so great, the wood breaks down pretty rapidly. Now, black locust for a wood is way more long-living as a raised bed wood, but it's ridiculously expensive. Although it's going to last like 15 plus years as a garden bed, but it's ridiculously expensive and is actually pretty difficult to get hold of. You have to go to a lumber yard and order it, especially. So think about what things are challenging for you right now. I'm guessing for a lot of you, it's money. So get creative about things that you can use to make raised beds with. Look for locally sourced and sustainable options that are untreated, like Forest Stewardship Council or FSC certified, long-lasting, rot-resistant. These things are all going to help your raised bed perform and look nice, in the years to come. But if you're looking for cheaper options, maybe think about repurposing stuff that was used in a different capacity. Try to check and make sure it wasn't manufactured prior to 2003 and isn't going to contain some of those weird and wonderful heavy metals that I mentioned. But maybe look at using other materials like bricks to edge your raised beds and have them lower. I've even seen on Pinterest where somebody did one out of beer bottles and wine bottles, which looked great. Where I live, it wouldn't be ideal because they're going to crack in those changes in temperature, but they might work for you and might be something that you're interested in. But just be aware that older materials, things like railroad ties, they contain, creosote or other chemicals that are going to be harmful to your garden and to you. So you shouldn't be using them near your edible plants. But it's ultimately up to you, right? It's your garden and you should grow how you want to. All right, next up is soil, and there's lots of soil combinations that are going to work well with your raised beds, but some don't. Potting soil, for example, is going to drain way too fast, and unless you've got a raised bed that's sitting on a concrete patio or gravel, where they act a lot more like a large container, don't use potting soil. You need something that's got a bit more substance, and it's a little bit more substantial than what potting soil is going to provide for a productive raised bed garden. You're going to need to mix in some raised bed soil and some compost, because that compost is going to provide that organic matter, and that's what feeds the microorganisms, which then feed your plants, right? Remember, we're wanting to help build a nice establishment for those microorganisms and worms and stuff to set up shop and help our raised beds, get better as time goes on. So when placing raised beds, I like to lift the soil in the ground with a garden fork just to loosen it, and then put cardboard over. That's going to help smother the weeds. It's also going to break down and provide organic matter. And then I fill with a mixture of garden topsoil, raised bed soil and compost mixed together. And then at the very top, I put a layer of compost on to help provide nutrients and also act a little bit like a mulch as well. And mulching your garden's actually really important because it's going to help reduce weeds. It's also going to protect the soil from erosion. So wind and water both, wash and blow away soil. So putting a mulch down to help not only retaining moisture in the soil, meaning that you can water less, but it's also helping keeping the soil there. I live in a very sandy area, so, you get a strong wind coming through and, you go outside and it's like being scoured. But having mulches on your raised beds is going to help protect them and keep them where they need to be. And also using organic mulches, things like, maybe you've got some cut grass, like untreated grass from mowing the lawn. Maybe you've got some straw. Some people even use wood chips and stuff. They're also going to help protect your soil from extremes of temperature. So they're going to help regulate the temperatures. Now, growing in a raised bed means that it's actually going to be warmer in your raised bed than it is in the ground to start with anyway, which is great in early spring because the ground's already starting to warm. But in the middle of a dry summer, using a mulch, it's going to help keep that water in, and it's going to help keep the temperatures of the soil a little bit cooler, so your plants are going to be able to keep growing a bit more. Now, there are a few things more frustrating when it comes to gardening than going out to my garden, planning to do some, little weeding or whatever in the raised beds. Yes, I do actually like to weed in the raised bed. But when I go out there and discover I've got like 3 foot of grass that's grown up all around the side of the raised beds, that can get really frustrating, and even more frustrating when I find that it's coming up inside the bed too. It looks horrible. It looks unkempt. Luckily, I've got a privacy fence so my neighbours don't really see. But if I lived more rurally, then I'd need to be thinking about snakes, bugs, and other critters just hanging out there. But more important, even in a suburban setting, weeds and stuff actually harbour pests and diseases that can decimate your vegetable garden. So it's a really good idea to prioritise path maintenance. So, if you don't want to keep mowing or weed whacking the grass and the weeds around your raised bed, then place a barrier down before the weeds and the grass emerge for the season. Now, we put down landscape fabric all over that side yard where our garden is, and weeds have found a way to come up, and they've also gotten settled into the mulch that we're using, because we've been using wood chips and over time they break down. So the mulch itself is turning into this really amazing soil, and the weeds are loving it and starting to grow. So we've been trying to tackle those, and one of the methods that we can do to tackle those is to place cardboard down and put more mulch down. So that's going to block out the light and smother those weeds, and then next couple of seasons we'll have to keep doing that again. So if you've got mulch around your raised beds, you are going to need to put more mulch down every season, okay? And you can use cheap things to do that. You can use brown craft paper, you can use paper grocery store bags, you can save up cardboard boxes from all the online deliveries, and then you can cover them with wood chips, which are more long lasting, sawdust or wood shavings, right? If you've got a bit of a bigger budget, then maybe you want to consider putting actual pathways down. Brick ones look really nice. They're also really easy to take care of. Grass ones, you're going to need to keep mowing them, but at least, you're not going to be, overrun with the grass so much. You already know it's kind of there, but the more that you're using garden pathways and stuff, grass is going to diminish as the ground gets more and more compacted. Other things that people have done is gravel. I've seen gravel quite a lot, but again, over time, you'll start to see that, weeds become established. So you do need to weed and maintain your pathways, and you need to be careful about what you're using to do the weeds. Some people like to use those flame burner things, which I think look absolutely epic, and I really want to do one. However, I live somewhere that's really, really dry and fires catch really easily, so it's probably not a great thing for me to be doing. Other people use vinegar, like neat vinegar on the weeds if it's something that they can't dig out by hand. But you don't really want to be using, any herbicides and things, because they can transfer into your raised bed, and all that hard work that you've put in helping to grow an organic garden is going to go to waste. So think about your path maintenance and make sure that you work that into your schedule as well. Well, that's it for this week. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Until next time, I hope your garden grows beautifully, and get out there and enjoy some sunshine. Until next time, I'm Emma from Misfit Gardening, and I hope that your garden grows beautifully.